Bloomberg Audio Studios. Podcasts, radio, news.
Good morning, I'm Nathan Hager.
And I'm Karen Moscow. Here are the stories we're following today.
We begin with politics around the world. A defiant Vladimir Putin says Russia will not be stopped from pursuing its goals. That's after Putin swept to a record victory in a presidential election whose outcome was predetermined. Putin, who is 71 years old and had no credible opponent, spoke after results showed him with more than 87% support from voters, and he now gets another 6 years as president. And we get more from Bloomberg's Rosalind Matheson.
For him, having those two numbers that he can talk about, which is the overall win rate for him, but also the turnout across Russia, is certainly something that he is touting. But his speech itself was quite defiant. Again, talking to those messages he's been saying for a while to people inside Russia, the sense that Russia is under siege from the outside, fundamentally under attack from the West, and that he's the only person who can help Russia stand proudly again. Those words that he said, people want to suppress us. They've not succeeded. They won't succeed now.
Bloomberg's Roz Matheson says turnout from 3 days of voting was more than 74%. That's the highest since Boris Yeltsin became president in 1991 after the collapse of the Soviet Union.
Now, Nathan, the latest on the war in the Middle East. Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu is pushing back on Senate Majority Leader Chuck Schumer's call for an Israel election. And Bloomberg's Ed Baxter has the story.
Netanyahu first says the aid issue to Gaza is complicated because when it does get in, Hamas loots it and uses it for its own gain. And on CNN, he says majority of Israelis support the government anyway.
I think what he said is totally inappropriate. It's inappropriate for to go to a sister democracy and try to replace the elected leadership there. That's something that the Israeli public does on its own, and we're not a banana republic.
Netanyahu also says its forces are trying to be careful, but that the move to remove Hamas will continue. Ed Baxter, Bloomberg Radio.
All right, Ed, thank you. Sticking with geopolitics, Secretary of State Antony Blinken is warning that disinformation is threatening this year's free and fair elections around the world.
As authoritarian and repressive regimes deploy technologies to undermine democracy and human rights, we need to ensure that technology sustains and supports democratic values and norms.
Speaking in South Korea at the Third Summit for Democracy, Secretary Blinken said authoritarian governments like China and Russia will try to leverage generative AI technologies to meddle in democratic elections this year, including in the U.S. and the U.K.
Well, in other political news, Nathan, former President Donald Trump held a rally over the weekend in Dayton, Ohio, for Republican Senate candidate Bernie Moreno. He threatened to impose 100% tariffs on Chinese cars made in Mexico if he's elected. He went on to say this.
Now, if I don't get elected, it's going to be a bloodbath for the whole. That's going to be the least of it. It's going to be a bloodbath for the country. That'll be the least of it.
Democrats were quick to seize on those comments. Former House Speaker Nancy Pelosi reacted on CNN's State of the Union.
We just have to win this election because he's even predicting a bloodbath. What does that mean? He's going to exact a bloodbath? There's something wrong here.
But Republican Congressman Mike Turner says the former president was not predicting political violence.
The president's statements concerning bloodbath were about what would happen in the auto industry if actually the Chinese manufacturers who were coming into Mexico were permitted to import into the United States.
Congressman Mike Turner made those comments on ABC's This Week, heard every Sunday on Bloomberg Radio.
Now, Karen, to a Bloomberg News exclusive. Apple is in talks to build Google's Gemini artificial intelligence engine into the iPhone. Sources say the two companies are in active negotiations to let Apple license Gemini, Google's set of generative AI models, to power some new features coming to iPhone software this year. Bloomberg technology reporter Mark Gurman says the deal would shake up the artificial intelligence world.
This would be a blockbuster agreement that has the potential to transform this still growing AI industry. Apple has been working on several new AI tools and services for iOS 18, its next iPhone software update. Those are going to be based on Apple's homegrown AI models, that Apple needs a partner for generative AI. That is the AI that all of us have been talking about for months.
Bloomberg's Mark Gurman says the deal would expand the two companies' search partnership as well. For years, Google's paid Apple billions to make its search engine the default option in the Safari web browser on iPhone and other devices. Shares of Alphabet are up more than 2% in the early trade, while Apple is higher by 0.5%.
Well, we turn to the economy now, Nathan. The Fed leads a busy week for global policy decisions, and we get a preview from Bloomberg's Michael McKee.
It's a big week for central bankers and those who invest on them. The Bank of Japan is the main event. Its governors have been inching ever closer to raising interest rates for the first time since 2007. While they may not go that far this week, they could end the purchase of stock ETFs for their balance sheet or suggest the end of yield curve control as a rate strategy. Either could have a major impact on the yen-dollar rate. The Fed isn't going to move rates, but investors will be watching to see if U.S. central bank officials increase their inflation forecasts or decrease the number of rate cuts they put into their dot plot. The Bank of England is also on hold. Growth has picked up and inflation come down some, but markets don't see an immediate rate cut on the horizon. Michael McKee, Bloomberg Radio.
All right, Mike, thanks. We got some new economic data out of China. Industrial output and investment grew more strongly than expected at the start of the year. Bloomberg Daybreak Asia anchor Brian Curtis has more from Hong Kong.
Factory output rose 7% in January and February from the same period last year, and that was faster than an estimate of 5.2%. Fixed asset investment grew 4.2%, also better than forecast. Now, those numbers suggest the economy is gaining some traction. On the other hand, consumer spending is proving somewhat more elusive. Retail sales up 5.5%, roughly in line. Consumer confidence is still weighed down by uncertainties over income. In Hong Kong, Brian Curtis, Bloomberg Radio.
All right, Brian, thank you. And it's time now for a look at some of the other stories making news in New York and around the world. For that, we're joined by Bloomberg's Michael Barr. Michael, good morning.
Good morning, Karen. Today, the Supreme Court will hear arguments in the National Rifle Association versus V. Velo. The NRA alleges that the New York State Department of Financial Services violated the group's right to freedom of speech by urging banks and insurance companies to cut ties with the group. The question is whether a state government regulator can tell state banks and insurance companies not to underwrite insurance contracts for members because the risks presented by school shootings and the bad PR that it brings. One person is dead. 2 other people are in stable condition after shots were fired in Jacksonville Beach, Florida. Jacksonville Beach Mayor Christine Hoffman.
This is Players Weekend. It's St. Patrick's Day. It's spring break. We have a lot going on out here. So the fact that we had a couple of bad actors out here that really made a dangerous situation for everyone is extremely tragic.
Police say they are looking for multiple suspects after one or more of the shooters opened fire in a crowded outdoor area. The White House is urging the Senate to pass a bill that would force the sale of TikTok. The measure passed in the House with support from lawmakers in both parties. TikTok is owned by Chinese parent company ByteDance. Supporters of the bill say it would protect the data of TikTok's more than 150 million users in the U.S. from Chinese Communist Party influence. But Democratic Congressman Ro Khanna, who represents Silicon Valley and voted against the TikTok bill, said concerns about CCP influence are misguided.
ByteDance is a Chinese company. It has 60% international investors, including KKR and General Atlantic. 3 of the 5 board members are Americans. They have data that currently Oracle is managing in Texas.
Congressman Khanna spoke on ABC's This Week, heard Sundays on Bloomberg. The Biden administration is rolling out an executive order to strengthen women's health research standards across federal agencies. The National Science Foundation and Department of Health and Human Services are instructed to research ways to use artificial intelligence toward advancing women's health research. It also directs the HHS to expand data collection on women's midlife health and menopause-related research. Australians will soon be able to enjoy 26 weeks of paid parental leave. Trade Unions President Michelle O'Neill says it's a win-win situation.
If you're able to stop work and receive pay, you're more likely to stay connected to your workplace.
The new deal will be gradually introduced over the next 3 years. Global news 24 hours a day, whenever you want it, with Bloomberg News Now. I'm Michael Barr. This is Bloomberg, Karen.
All right, Michael, thank you. It's time now for the Bloomberg Sports Update, brought to you by Tri-State Audi. And for that, we bring in John Stashower. John, good morning.
Good morning, Karen. Thrilling finish to the Players' Championship. Defending champ Scotty Scheffler went out early, caught fire, shot 64, got to 20 under par to take the lead, and then waited to see if anyone could catch him. 3 golfers went to the 72nd hole, 1 shot behind, needing a birdie. All 3 settled for pars, including Wyndham Clark, whose putt was seemingly in the hole, and then it wasn't. Scheffler, the first ever repeat winner.
I needed some help, obviously, going into today if I wanted to win the tournament, and I felt like if I could go out and shoot a good round on the front nine, I could put myself in it as long as, one of them didn't shoot, 4 or 5 under on the front as well. And so the birdie on 9 was huge, and, I was right in the tournament the whole back 9.
Meanwhile, a meeting planned for today, a sit-down between the PGA Tour Players Board that includes Tiger Woods and the Saudi Yasser Al Rumayyan, who heads the fund that backs the LIV Tour. That deal struck several months ago between the 2 tours, not yet official. Tennis, Carlos Alcaraz straight-setted Daniil Medvedev won at Indian Wells for the 2nd straight year. Iga Swiatek took the women's final. NCAA tournament field is set. Defending champion UConn, the top overall seed. St. John's didn't make it. The bubble shrunk as 4 conference tournaments were won by teams unexpectedly. That hurt the Red Storm, who then chose not to play the consolation NIT. At the Garden, Rangers beat the Islanders 5-2 with 5 different goal scorers. The Devils lost 3-1 at Vegas. Nets lost in overtime at San Antonio. The rookie Victor Wembanyama scored 33 at 15 rebounds. The Celtics crushed the Wizards. Knicks played tonight at Golden State. Knicks are 2-0 on this road trip. Jalen Brunson has scored 45 and 42 points. Yankees lost to the Red Sox 12-6. The Sox scored 9 runs in the first inning. John Stashower, Bloomberg Sports.
I want to get you set for a trading week that'll be dominated by central bank policy decisions around the world, not the least of which coming from the Federal Reserve. We're joined now by Lori Calvasina, head of U.S. equity strategy at RBC Capital Markets. Great to speak with you as always, Lori. It's going to be a very busy week, but I want to get right first to your latest note looking at energy stocks as potential outperformers in this rally. Can you get into that a little bit for us?
Sure. So thanks for having me as always. And look, I think there's just a lot going on in the energy space right now. We've obviously got some heightened geopolitical tensions in the backdrop, the oil prices on the move. But when I put that aside and just look at our work, the thing that's been coming up in my meetings there the past week is just there's all this worry about the Fed and inflation being sticky out there again. Big topic of conversation. How do you play that? Well, energy is one of the sectors that tends to actually outperform when 10-year yields are rising. So we left our overweight on this year. It was somewhat of a controversial decision, but we said at the time that we really viewed it as an inflation hedge in our portfolio. We like the enthusiasm of our analysts. We like the valuations. And so it's interesting to see you're really starting to see this sector move all of a sudden. And it's really kind of functioning in our portfolios the way we intend it to start the year in case this inflation risk came back.
Do you think then that energy could be a leader for the rally, that we could see a shift away from the mega cap tech names that have dominated for the last several months?
So I think you have to look at both sides of that trade. And I do think that energy is a natural beneficiary if that rotation trade, does sort of resume in a sustainable way. And there are signs in the data that rotation trade is really trying to get started again, not quite with the same kind of power that it had back in November and December, but we are seeing, in a lot of different quant metrics that we look at that you're starting to see some shift away. And I think energy is not really enough on its own to sort of absorb all that market cap. So I think there are things like small caps. Industrials has also been doing well of late. Financials is another one to keep an eye on. There's a lot of market cap there. But generally, I think the market is starting to respond to the idea that economic expectations are coming in better than expected. GDP forecast up to 2.1% for this year. And that really should pull people out of, kind of more of the defensive secular growth names to some extent and into more cyclical areas of the market. Energy would be in that bucket.
Yeah, and that takes us to the policy decision and the look ahead to further Federal Reserve policy making for the rest of this year. Are you thinking that the Fed is going to push back even further on expectations that the first rate cut could come even later in the summer?
So our team is still in the June camp, and, that has been in line with a lot of the messaging that we've seen from the Fed for quite some time. So we'll see, of course, what the commentary shows. I think that the idea of kind of March cuts, that was so popular to come into the year. It really sort of mystified me where that was coming from. But that's obviously kind of undoing that view has been a big focal point for investors this year. So our team still thinks they're going to move in June. I think, the commentary is always of interest to me in terms of just the characterization of inflation and the economy. But we'll see how the market reacts. I think there's so much angst that's already been baked in.
Yeah, just to talk a little bit more about that potential market reaction, what could the messaging from the Fed do when it comes to your thinking about large cap versus small cap stocks, which, of course, small cap is so sensitive to what happens in the economic data?
Now, I think that's important. There are a few cross currents for small caps going on now, right? Because a hot economy tends to benefit small caps. They do tend to be more cyclical and just sort of more exposed to those hopes and fears around where the domestic economy is headed. But at the same time, small caps have really needed rate cuts to kind of get their stabilization in versus large cap. Historically, we do tend to see small caps outperform when the first cuts come in, and they pre-traded a lot of that back in November and December. So I think the cuts are the kind of first issue, but I do think the economic descriptions matter as well. And so for small caps to work, we've really got to see the needle threaded where you get the cuts and the economic expectations continue to improve.
This is Bloomberg Daybreak Today, your morning brief on the stories making news from Wall Street to Washington and beyond.
Look for us on your podcast feed at 6 a.m. Eastern each morning on Apple, Spotify, and anywhere else you get your podcasts.
You can also listen live each morning starting at 5 a.m. Wall Street time on Bloomberg 1130 in New York, Bloomberg 99.1 in Washington, Bloomberg 106.1 in Boston, and Bloomberg 960 in San Francisco.
Our flagship New York station is also available on your Amazon Alexa devices. Just say, Alexa, play Bloomberg 1130.
Plus, listen coast to coast on the Bloomberg Business app, SiriusXM, the iHeartRadio app, and on Bloomberg.com. I'm Nathan Hager.
And I'm Karen Moscow. Join us again tomorrow morning for all the news you need to start your day right here on Bloomberg Daybreak.